Phil Ochs died in silence, slipping away without the noise or recognition his voice once commanded. Yet Bob Dylan's silence stretched even further. Years, then decades, as if he had locked an entire era behind a door no one was allowed to open. The two men had once walked shoulder to shoulder, had sung under the same lights, had lifted the same ideals like banners in the wind. And then, almost without warning, they became two figures standing at opposite sides of a widening chasm. Their relationship disappeared so deeply that younger generations barely knew it existed at all. But time has a way of forcing buried truths upwards. And when Dylan finally broke his long-held silence, his words rattled the folk music world with a confession that peeled back layers of loyalty, ego, bitterness, and betrayal, layers that had been building since the early 1960s. To understand how the rift began, the tape must rewind to 1962. Greenwich Village, New York, was the heartbeat of a restless generation. Cafes overflowed with cigarette smoke and arguments about justice, war, and art. It was here, in this crucible of rebellion and reinvention, that Phil Ochs arrived, a young man with a journalism background and a sharp political edge. His songs were not just melodies. They were headlines set to chords, filled with urgency and conviction. At the same time, Bob Dylan was already becoming a magnetic force. With his harmonica rack around his neck and his unfiltered poetry, he was fast becoming the voice of a movement that demanded something new. Both men shared a goal that seemed simple: speak truth, shake the country, and use music as a vehicle for change. Ochs delivered songs with razor-point clarity, condemning war, injustice, and political hypocrisy. Dylan, too, held the torch of protest at first. Songs like Blowin' in the Wind and The Times They Are A-Changin' made him the reluctant prophet of an entire generation. The two young artists found themselves running on parallel tracks, meeting in crowded village venues like the Kettle of Fish, where debates never ended and no idea was too grand. People who were there recall moments of mutual admiration. Dylan once saying that Ochs really understood what folk music was fighting for. They performed at the same festivals, shared the same audiences, and represented the vanguard of the American folk revival. Even without collaborating directly, they symbolized the unfiltered conscience of their time. But harmony rarely lasts in a rapidly evolving artistic landscape. The first hints of divergence appeared quietly, almost imperceptibly. Dylan began using his notebook differently, not for slogans or rallying cries, but for internal storms, private fears, cryptic reflections. His album, Another Side of Bob Dylan, was a turning point. Gone were the calls for social action, replaced by introspective riddles and surreal imagery. Ochs, on the other hand, refused to dilute his political fire. He produced songs like Draft Dodger Rag, I Ain't Marching Anymore, and Here's to the State of Mississippi, songs that cut straight to the bone of America's conflicts. People around them noticed the shift. Ochs once remarked publicly, "Bob is moving away from what we started. He's just writing about himself now." It wasn't said with malice. It was spoken like a man who felt a friend drifting into unfamiliar waters. Dylan, meanwhile, felt boxed in by the expectations of protest music. To him, music was meant to explode boundaries, not stay trapped in one political lane. He didn't want to be told what his art should or shouldn't be. As he grew more experimental, he quietly stepped away from the circles that insisted on keeping folk music tethered to activism. The divide deepened in 1964 when Dylan released My Back Pages. Its lyrics were unmistakable. He was renouncing the very stances that had earned him reverence. "I was so much older then, I'm younger than that now," he sang, signaling a declaration of artistic independence. To Phil Ochs, this was a betrayal of purpose. While Ochs continued producing fiercely political songs, Dylan drifted further into metaphorical terrain. Folk purists felt abandoned, and Ochs, who never enjoyed Dylan's global reach, felt the ground shifting beneath him. Then came the electric thunderbolt. Dylan's decision to embrace electric instruments sent shockwaves through the folk community. The iconic moment at Newport, the booze, the bewilderment. This all became the dividing line between the old world and the new. Ochs watched all of this with a mixture of confusion and hurt. He wasn't angry that Dylan was experimenting. He was hurt that Dylan seemed to be discarding the movement they had fought for. He believed music should reflect reality, challenge power, and speak for those without microphones. To him, Dylan's departure wasn't simply artistic, it felt like abandonment. There were private moments, 2. Conversations where Dylan dismissed political songwriting as nonsense, expressing his belief that art shouldn't be used to indoctrinate. These words stung Ochs deeply. They weren't just insults. They attacked the entire foundation of who Phil Ochs was. And Ochs, never one to swallow his beliefs, responded with equal bluntness in interviews. He said Dylan had deserted the cause, turning his back on the very people who once saw him as their champion. Tension simmered until they reached a boiling point during a peace concert they attended together. What happened afterward became one of the most infamous stories in American music history. After the show, they sat in a limousine, a tight, uncomfortable space charged with unspoken resentments. Dylan played Ochs a recording of his new song, "Can You Please Crawl Out Your Window?" hoping for feedback or validation. Ochs listened carefully, then gave his honest reaction. He said it was okay, but nothing special. For most artists, this would have been simple criticism, but Dylan took it as the deepest kind of betrayal. He exploded. He told the driver to stop the car, turned on Ochs with icy fury, and delivered a sentence that would echo for years. "You're not a folk singer. You're just a journalist." Then he ordered Ochs out of the limousine. In that single moment, whatever thread of friendship remained snapped. The symbolic imagery was undeniable. Dylan stayed inside the car, continuing his journey while Ochs was left standing on the street, cut loose and alone. From that point onward, their paths diverged dramatically. Dylan ascended into global superstardom, his lyrics studied, his persona mythologized, his every move dissected by critics. Meanwhile, Phil Ochs struggled against a changing tide. The world that once celebrated his political clarity now saw him as part of an outdated era. Audiences dwindled. The media that had once praised him began to forget him. Even within the folk community, he felt a growing indifference. Some insiders later shared that Ochs carried a deep bitterness, not because Dylan succeeded, but because Ochs felt erased. He believed that those who had once preached solidarity abandoned him when the industry's spotlight shifted. Dylan never spoke publicly about Ochs. Interviews came and went. But when Phil's name surfaced, Dylan sidestepped it with the precision of a man who wanted the past to stay buried. The silence was so complete that people interpreted it as contempt. Others believed Dylan was avoiding reopening old wounds. Whatever the reason, his silence created an unspoken wall that grew thicker with each passing year. Meanwhile, Ochs battled his own demons. Personal tragedies, emotional strain, and professional setbacks weighed on him heavily. The artistic world had changed, and he felt left behind, not just by Dylan, but by an entire generation that once swore never to forget him. The loneliness carved deep grooves into his life, and as his struggles intensified, Dylan's silence felt louder than ever. Ochs's death closed a chapter that many believed would remain unspoken forever. But time has a strange way of softening even the hardest edges. Years after Ochs was gone, Dylan finally spoke. His words were brief but powerful. He acknowledged Ochs's brilliance, admired his courage, and admitted that despite their differences, Ochs had been one of the finest writers of their era. It wasn't an apology, nor was it an attempt to rewrite the past. It was simply honesty, raw, late, but meaningful. The revelation stunned those who had followed their story. The silence that had lasted decades finally cracked, exposing the truth that both men had been shaped by the same fire, even if they ultimately walked toward different destinies. In the end, their story isn't just about music. It's about ideals, pride, vulnerability, rivalry, and the painful ways friendships can fracture under the weight of ambition and change. It's about how two voices that once blended into a powerful harmony became echoes drifting apart, carried into different corners of history. And it's about how silence, even the longest silence, can one day break, revealing what was buried beneath it all along. Phil Ochs had always carried the weight of expectation heavier than most realized. To the movement, he wasn't just a musician, he was a soldier of truth. Every lyric he wrote was expected to echo the streets. Every album required to challenge the system. There was no room for experiments, no space for personal confusion, no allowance for emotional fatigue. The crown of political folk singer looked noble from afar, but up close it was sharp-edged, and it cut into him more with every passing year. While Dylan broke free of labels, Ochs remained trapped inside the one he once embraced proudly, and with every artistic evolution Dylan undertook, the contrast between them grew more painful. Dylan was allowed to transform. Ochs was expected to stay the same. This unspoken pressure became another silent wall between them, one neither had the courage or clarity to acknowledge. As Dylan's fame skyrocketed, the spaces around him changed. The rooms grew larger, the faces more strategic, the conversations filtered. Fans didn't just admire him, they worshipped him. Journalists didn't interview him, they dissected him. And the expectations placed on Dylan created a loneliness of its own kind, a loneliness hidden behind headlines and applause. Ochs, watching from the outside, misinterpreted this isolation as arrogance. He saw Dylan distancing himself from old friends and old circles, and it hurt him. But he couldn't see the truth from afar. Dylan hadn't abandoned everyone. He was drowning in a world where he could no longer breathe freely. Fame had turned into a prison, and Dylan was desperately trying to carve an escape route by reinventing himself. In another life, the two men might have understood each other's suffering. In this life, neither could. There were whispers among musicians who knew Dylan closely, whispers that the breakup with Phil Ochs left a shadow in Dylan's mind. He never admitted it publicly, but some said he could never fully shake the memory of that limousine moment. Dylan was known for cutting people off abruptly, yet Ochs was different. Ochs had believed in him when the world was still figuring him out. Ochs had defended him in village bars when critics tried to tear him down. Ochs had once called Dylan the future of American songwriting. Walking away from a friend like that doesn't come without ghosts. Whenever Dylan wrote something politically charged in later decades, some believed he paused, remembering Ochs, wondering whether he had judged him too harshly, whether he had misunderstood the man who only wanted to speak truth in a world growing deaf. The American folk revival that once stood like a powerful wave didn't last forever. By the late 60s and early 70s, the movement was fragmenting. The Vietnam War dragged on. The idealism of early protest years hardened into cynicism. The culture shifted toward rock, psychedelia, and commercial spectacle. The purity of the folk scene, small clubs, honest voices, raw chords, was fading into something the movement never intended. For Phil Ochs, this era felt like watching a house collapse, brick by brick. For Dylan, it was a time to explore new sounds, new identities. Where Dylan saw opportunity, Ochs saw loss. The very movement that had brought them together now became the force pulling them apart. Years after both men had played their last notes, their impact continued to ripple through new generations of artists. Songwriters studying protest music found Ochs's directness refreshing, raw, and courageous. Others found Dylan's shape-shifting genius revolutionary. Many felt torn between the two, caught between the clarity of Ochs and the mystery of Dylan. In death, Ochs became an icon of purity, a martyr of message over fame. In life, Dylan became the symbol of evolution, art as a living, breathing organism. Together they represented two halves of a movement, one unyielding, the other transformative. One rooted in truth, the other in imagination. One remembered for what he fought, the other remembered for how he reinvented. And perhaps that is why their story still matters. Because it reflects a deeper question every artist, every activist, and every dreamer eventually faces: do you hold the line, or do you change direction? Even though the two men stood apart in life, their music remains intertwined forever. You cannot study Dylan without encountering Ochs. You cannot understand Ochs without acknowledging Dylan. Their rivalry was painful, but it was also productive. It pushed both of them toward their destinies. History remembers tension because tension reveals truth. History remembers both men because both fought for something real. And history remembers their silence because silence often says more than words ever could. When Dylan finally broke that silence years later, it wasn't just a tribute. It was a quiet admission that Phil Ochs had mattered all along, more than he ever said, more than he ever showed, more than the world ever realized. Fame is a strange force. It lifts one person into the sky while casting shadows over everyone around them. After Dylan's ascent, those shadows began stretching far across the folk landscape, touching even the brightest talents. Musicians who once stood side by side with him suddenly found themselves measured not by their own merit, but by how close or far they were from Dylan's orbit. Phil Ochs felt this comparison deeply. Every performance, every review, every conversation eventually circled back to Dylan. Even fans asking for autographs would slip in comments about Dylan's latest album. Ochs didn't despise Dylan for his success, but he felt crushed by a system that believed comparison was the only language worth speaking. The industry didn't just elevate Dylan, it unintentionally diminished everyone else. In quiet moments, Ochs admitted to friends he feared history would erase him, not because he lacked talent, but because the world only remembers one hero at a time. Behind Phil Ochs' powerful voice was a man unraveling under pressures no one truly understood. The early 70s were brutal for him. The folk revival had faded, and the political scene was shifting in ways that no longer aligned with the clarity of his songwriting. He traveled across states performing in half-filled halls, watching his audiences shrink year after year. It was a painful sight for someone who once performed before thousands who hung on every syllable. Critics called him outdated. Industry insiders labeled him stuck in the 60s, and the movement he once embodied was dissolving, leaving him stranded with no new direction to follow. His mental health began to fray. Friends noticed mood swings, paranoia, unresolved trauma from fame and failure piling on quietly. For a man who poured the world's pain into his songs, he had no place to pour his own. Dylan's silence didn't cause this downfall, but to Ochs, it symbolized how completely the world had changed without him. As Ochs struggled, Dylan became mythic. No longer just a songwriter, he had become a symbol, a puzzle people loved trying to solve. Every lyric he wrote, people treated like scripture. Every interview, critics studied as if decoding a prophecy. Dylan didn't create this myth, but he didn't fight it either. It insulated him, shielded him, separated him. Some who were close to him said that Dylan's silence about Phil Ochs wasn't cruelty. It was self-protection. He was exhausted by being the center of every cultural debate. He didn't want to reopen old chapters because each chapter carried 1,000 interpretations. But myths have a side effect. They erase the details of real human stories. And Ochs, who once fought battles beside Dylan, risked becoming one of those details lost in the margins of history. There were friends, mutual friends, who tried to bring them back into the same room. Some believed the men needed closure, others believed the movement needed healing. A few simply couldn't accept that two of the greatest writers of their era were stuck in a silent war neither fully intended. But every attempt failed. Dylan was constantly touring, reinventing himself and avoiding emotional entanglements. Ochs was drifting deeper into personal turmoil. The time for reconciliation passed quietly, not with anger, but with exhaustion. They became two stories running parallel, never intersecting again. Sometimes the saddest endings aren't caused by dramatic betrayals. They're caused by time slipping away. In the late years of Phil Ochs' life, he still talked about Dylan occasionally, not with rage, but with a sorrowful admiration. He acknowledged Dylan's genius even when the two could no longer speak. He praised Dylan's words even when Dylan refused to address him. Behind the bitterness lay respect, and behind the respect lay heartbreak. There's a recording from a small concert where Ochs mentions Dylan with a soft, almost broken smile. He jokes about Dylan being the famous one, but behind the laughter you can hear a man who wishes their story had ended differently. For all the harsh moments, Ochs never fully stopped caring. And that was perhaps the most tragic part. When Phil Ochs died, Dylan didn't release a statement, not immediately, not publicly. People interpreted it as indifference, but those who knew Dylan closely said his silence wasn't coldness. It was grief expressed in the only way Dylan knew how, without words. He struggled with the ghosts of the past, the regrets of the rift, and the realization that reconciliation would never come. In private, he played Ochs' songs. He read Ochs' lyrics. He remembered the early days in the village when two young men believed they could change the world just by strumming guitars. Dylan didn't grieve loudly. He grieved inwardly. Years later, at a tribute event, Dylan said something that no one expected. He called Phil Ochs one of the greatest and most honest songwriters of their generation. He spoke of Ochs' fearlessness, his courage, his refusal to compromise truth even when the world punished him for it. These words cracked decades of silence. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a rewriting of history. It was simply respect, delayed but real. For fans of Ochs, these words meant the world. For those who followed Dylan, the confession added a new layer to his legend. And for the folk movement, it reinforced the truth that both men shaped the era. even if they did so in different ways. Today, Phil Ochs is studied, celebrated, rediscovered by new generations seeking pure political songwriting. His lyrics appear in documentaries, textbooks, protest movements, and university courses. His name rises again whenever people speak of courage in art. Bob Dylan remains the chameleon, the genius, the unmatched poet of American music. But scholars now say you cannot fully understand Dylan without understanding the friction with Ochs. Their story is part of the DNA of American folk music. One pushed the movement forward through reinvention. The other kept it grounded in truth through conviction. Together they shaped an era that defined the cultural identity of a turbulent America. In the end, the story of Dylan and Ochs is not about who was right or wrong. It is a story about two brilliant minds whose paths diverged because both were trying to survive in different ways. One survived by transforming. One tried to survive by staying the same. Both were necessary. Both were brave. Both left legacies that echo far beyond their own lifetimes. Their silence, their conflict, their admiration, and their pain all blend into a single truth. Some relationships don't end with fights. They end with echoes that never quite disappear.